want to switch now to another topic, another story you've been following, and that is these debilitating medical ailments. They become known as the Havana Syndrome. Here we are 6 months in since this was first discovered. What steps is the Biden administration taking on this?
So these are serious ailments reported by hundreds of people across government over the last 5 years. For the first ones were in Havana. And the Biden administration says this is one of their top priorities. And so they've created new standards of care that allows or ensures that people who report symptoms get proper treatment. They've created new processes for intelligence sharing across the agency so everyone can see details of possible cases. And they've lowered the reporting threshold to encourage possible victims to report their symptoms. But understanding the source, Judy, remains a real challenge. Last administration, CIA analyzed what device could exist that could possibly recreate some of these symptoms, and they had real challenges on the size of a device and a device needing line of sight to these hypothetical targets. They also had a review or a scrub of all intelligence, current and former, of any foreign entity talking about or deploying any of this kind of technology, and it came up empty. So this administration says those efforts have been reinvigorated, not only the reporting, the treating, but the technical hunt for the cause of this, and CIA has approached that hunt like it did the hunt for Osama bin Laden.
Wow. So are they any closer to figuring out the cause?
In a word, no. They don't know who, what, or if anyone set out to target U.S. officials. There was a panel of medical experts last year that concluded that it could have been microwave radiation, and that panel of experts pointed out that the Russians have researched using microwave radiation in the past. But senior administration officials still say they do not know if this is a foreign actor's actions or perhaps some kind of inadvertent side effect of overly aggressive surveillance or something else. And partially, it's a range of apparent victims. Intelligence agents who work on Russia say they've had these symptoms. Diplomats working in Europe, even a White House official late last year. And after that incident, there was a deputies meeting in the National Security Council, and they decided they simply did not have enough evidence to know what was really going on. And that conclusion remains today. Take a quick listen to Secretary of State Tony Blinken last month.
We do not know who, if anyone, is actually responsible, state actor, individuals. This is exactly what we're trying to get to the bottom of.
Blinken's who, if anyone, angered a lot of people in Congress and victims. Look, there are still doubts about the cause, but this administration says they're focusing more resources to help the apparent victims and try and find the cause.
So interesting, after all these years, they still don't know.
They still don't know.
Nick Schifrin, we thank you.
Thank you.
Investigators are looking into at least 2 incidents of the so-called Havana Syndrome attacks in the United States, mysterious invisible attacks leading to symptoms such as ear-popping, vertigo, headaches, nausea. One of the attacks came near the White House. It sickened a national security official. You've been focusing on this on the Intelligence Committee. What have you learned that you can tell us? How concerned should Americans be?
I am absolutely outraged at these attacks on our American personnel serving overseas. They started in Havana, or were first identified there. There's a mysterious direct energy weapon that is being used, and it is causing, in some cases, permanent traumatic brain injury. And yet the personnel involved, there have been other attacks around the world, have had a difficult time getting both the medical care and the financial help that they need from the CIA. And that is outrageous. What we need to do, and I'm introducing and working on legislation, is to ensure they get the medical care and the financial compensation that they need. And we need a whole of government approach to identify what adversary is targeting American personnel who are serving particularly overseas. But now we hear reports of cases here. I am hopeful that with the new CIA director, whom I've talked to about this issue twice, he is committed, and also the chair, Mark Warner, and the vice chair, Marco Rubio of the Intelligence Committee, have announced that we're going to continue our investigations and get to the bottom of this absolutely outrageous attacks on our men and women who are serving our country.
Let's turn to the state of the Republican Party.
TI update: the HAVANA Act and Havana Syndrome Attacks Response Act, June 7, 2021, helping American victims afflicted by neurological attacks. HAVANA Act, built to support Havana Syndrome victims, unanimously passes Senate. The legislation, led by Senators Collins, Warner, Rubio, and Shaheen, would support U.S. intelligence and diplomatic staff who have suffered head injuries from likely directed energy attacks in Cuba, China, and elsewhere.
Washington, D.C. Today, the Senate unanimously passed legislation to support American public servants who have incurred brain injuries from likely directed energy attacks. The Helping American Victims Afflicted by Neurological Attacks, HAVANA Act, which was authored by Senator Susan Collins, RME, along with Intelligence Committee Chairman Mark R. Warner, D.V.A., Vice Chairman Marco Rubio, R.F.L., and Jean Shaheen, D.N.H., would authorize additional financial support for injured individuals.
Havana syndrome is the term given to an illness that first surfaced among more than 40 U.S. embassy staff in Havana, Cuba, beginning in 2016. Since then, at least a dozen U.S. diplomats at the U.S. consulate in Guangzhou suffered symptoms consistent with the effects of directed, pulsed, radio frequency energy, and there have been, according to the press, more than 130 total cases among American personnel, including on U.S. soil. Symptoms have included severe headaches, dizziness, tinnitus, visual and hearing problems, vertigo, and cognitive difficulties, and many affected personnel continue to suffer from health problems years after the attacks. The HAVANA Act would give the CIA Director, the Secretary of State, and other agency heads additional authority to provide financial and medical support to those suffering from brain injuries as a result of these attacks. Far too many Havana Syndrome victims have had to battle the bureaucracy to receive care for their debilitating injuries. American personnel who have undergone these attacks while serving our country should be treated the same way we would treat a soldier who suffered a traumatic injury on the battlefield, said Senator Collins. I am pleased that there has been widespread, bipartisan support for my bill, which will provide additional support to these government employees who were harmed while representing our interests. We also need a whole-of-government approach to determine what this weapon is and who is wielding it in order to prevent future attacks and protect Americans. As the Intelligence Committee continues to push for more answers on these mysterious and debilitating attacks, I'm proud that the Senate overwhelmingly approved this bipartisan bill to ensure our U.S. personnel receive the compensation and care they rightfully deserve, said Senate Intel Chairman Warner. We continue to be indebted to these brave men and women who proudly serve our country while putting their own safety on the line, and this bill will make sure that we can provide financial relief as they seek medical treatment for the injuries they've endured. I am pleased to see the Senate pass this important bipartisan legislation, which will provide the CIA Director and the U.S. Secretary of State with the authorities needed to properly assist U.S. personnel who have endured attacks while serving our nation, Senate Intel Vice Chairman Rubio said. There is no doubt that the victims who have suffered brain injuries must be provided with adequate care and compensation. Further, it is critical that our government determine who is behind these attacks and that we respond. It is shameful and unacceptable that so many American public servants and their families who are suffering from these mysterious brain injuries have gone without access to the medical benefits they need and deserve. That must change. And today, the Senate took an important step forward to help right that wrong, said Senator Shaheen. Securing appropriate support for those injured has been a priority of mine for years. And I'm glad to partner with Senator Collins and this bipartisan group of lawmakers to build on that progress and help provide additional compensation for afflicted U.S. personnel. This bipartisan bill helps create a uniform response to these attacks. And I'll keep working across the aisle to get to the bottom of these attacks and to support those suffering from critical injuries.
The HAVANA Act would authorize the CIA Director and the Secretary of State to provide injured employees with additional financial support for brain injuries. Both the CIA and State Department would be required to create regulations detailing fair and equitable criteria for payment. This legislation would also require the CIA and State Department to report to Congress on how this authority is being used and if additional legislative or administrative action is required. August 9, 2021, McCaul introduces legislation targeting Havana Syndrome Attacks. U.S. Representative Michael McCaul, RTX, ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, announced Monday that he had introduced legislation responding to sonic attacks on U.S. diplomatic personnel worldwide. Called the Havana Syndrome Attacks Response Act, the legislation seeks to protect diplomatic personnel from further attacks, as well as hold those responsible for the directed, pulsed radio frequency energy attacks accountable. Around the world, American personnel are being attacked in their homes, in hotels, and even on public streets, McCaul said. What first started in Havana in late 2016 has now expanded to more than 130 possible cases from all around the world, including right here in Washington, D.C. That's why I've introduced the Havana Syndrome Attacks Response Act. We must find out who's behind these attacks and hold them responsible, and we must reassure the people who serve our nation overseas that we have their backs. Specifically, the legislation would punish those responsible for the attacks, provide assistance to personnel subjected to attacks, and prioritize research into protective countermeasures. Additionally, the legislation would impose sanctions against those the president determines carried out the attacks, including blocking property and denying visas to perpetrators. The legislation would also give the government the ability to impose sanctions against the governments of perpetrators, including prohibiting U.S. foreign assistance, restrictions on trade, prohibition on arms sales, prohibitions on foreign military financing, and denial of U.S. credit or financial assistance. The legislation would also give the government the ability to impose sanctions against the governments of perpetrators, including prohibiting U.S. foreign assistance, restrictions on trade, prohibition on arms sales, prohibitions on foreign military financing, and denial of U.S. credit or financial assistance. The legislation would also require Congress to be briefed on the attacks and to be given a report on the U.S. response to the attacks within 6 months.
Dr. Robert Duncan worked as a scientist on neuroweapons for the CIA and the Department of Defense. This is what he had to say concerning the Havana Syndrome. I hate pointing out the obvious, but the State Department is lying or scientifically dumb or both. These weapons are well known since the 1960s, and they only have to talk to the CIA or the DoD to learn about them. They claim a handful of U.S. citizens have complained about the same symptoms, but that is a lie. I have seen all of the emails and letters to them. It's in the tens of thousands. The U.S. government has become so corrupt or incompetent that they don't represent the country's values anymore since Kennedy's assassination.
In other news, the Science and Technology Directorate, S&T, is a component within the United States Department of Homeland Security, DHS. S&T serves as the research and development arm of the department as it fulfills its national security mission.